Yeah, I thought what I would do is start out by giving some background on what I've been doing and why for the last several years, and then throw it to Sam in terms of drilling into some of the technical aspects of what we've been up to. For context, I started focusing on the intersection of tech and media around 2009. I had a startup that was aggregating local event data for the family audience, and I had turned it into a little widget that could be embedded on local news websites, and I was assuming that we would monetize that product by partnering with local media companies to sell advertising against this widget's user experience. And so I was spending a lot of time talking to local TV stations, local newspapers, and this was in 2008 and 2009. And it was in those meetings that I first became acquainted with the challenges that the news industry was really facing. I had meetings with all of these folks that worked in local news, and in every single meeting, they were super depressed. And so it was very sad. Like, all of these meetings were so sad. And I was wondering why. Well, it's because in 2006, we had kind of a high watermark for the news industry in the U.S. as far as the number of journalists employed for the purpose of journalism, which is to hold power accountable and maintain democracy in a civil society. Since 2006, by about 2010, we had laid off over 40% of those people. And so as a result, local news, like the local TV stations, the local newspapers, were feeling this pressure economically in really, really palpable ways. And then here I come along as this guy from Silicon Valley with this new product and technology, and in many cases, they viewed me as if I was the barbarian amassing at the gate about to destroy their whole world. And so it made for really challenging partnership discussions. And so I thought, this is a real bummer. I'm clearly not going to be partnering with this industry. And then also, it was 2009. I needed to raise an A round of financing. It's better to be lucky than smart, and I was unlucky trying to raise an A round of financing at the worst time in American history for a digital media company. And so I put that on the shelf, and I started consulting for a while, primarily with media companies that wanted to transition to digital. And then it was in that I was also working with some technology companies, including YouTube. And the more I was consulting with YouTube on engaging in the media industry, the more I was realizing how Google was not really the necessarily causing the economic challenges that the news industry was facing, but it was benefiting from the dynamics that were inadvertently hurting the news industry. And so I ended up thinking I should just go work for Google so that I can help save the news business, because we need it in our society. We need it to maintain democracy. And if we don't actually find a way to fund it in the digital economy, it will erode to nothing, and then we'll be without that industry that holds power accountable. And so Google was kind of managing the digital economy on behalf of the world, and I thought they should be doing something about this problem. So I interviewed at Google, and back then it was kind of like interviewing for a master's degree, where you have this thesis and you're kind of going into it. And so after a few months, I ended up getting a job to start the news partnerships team at YouTube, which I did for a couple of years before realizing that YouTube wasn't going to be playing a significant role in the economics of the news industry anytime soon. And so as fun as it was to work for YouTube, I transitioned over to a strategy team at Google, where I could look across all of Google's product areas and try and understand how to bring all of Google's product areas to a point where they could participate in a more viable engagement with the news industry. Like, what could Google do to improve the economics for journalism in the digital economy? And so my role gave me kind of an unusual opportunity to look across the business models of all of the product areas that were operating in very siloed ways at Google back then, and come up with a lot of ideas. Some of those ideas I was able to pursue. Many of the ideas I was not able to pursue. And I zeroed in on a couple fundamental challenges to the media business model on the open web. One of those fundamental challenges was the fact that when you take a traditional media business model, which requires you to get audience to all come to a particular location, either read your newspaper or watch your TV station or come to your website. And you apply that old media business model, which is an aggregation model, and you apply that to the web, things break down, because the web was started 29 years ago as this decentralized network that was designed to propagate information across the network. It wasn't designed to aggregate audience to a particular node or domain. So there was a fundamental problem in that the media business model was misaligned with the inherent architecture of the new medium. But media companies were forced to try and apply this old business model to this new decentralized architecture medium because they didn't have what they needed technically to actually try and pursue a distributed media business model. They didn't have the technologies that would allow them to actually take their content and their business and distribute it across the internet. So what I thought we needed was basically a method or a technology that would allow for the business to travel with the content across a distributed network, and we didn't have that. We had RSS as a standard for actually, putting content from one publisher on another publisher's website. But there were real challenges around that had to do with the fact that it was not, a human had to talk to another human and figure out what parts of the content do you want and what are going to be the terms of our business relationship. And when you have humans involved, it's unscalable. And so the world lacked this kind of standard for content syndication across the open web. The other problem that I zeroed in on was the fact that the web economy uses user data as like a natural resource. It's kind of like what oil is to the energy industry. The companies that have the greatest resources are going to be the ones with the highest market cap in this sector, and publishers were not in a position to leverage user data in the same way as were platforms. Because you have Google, you have Facebook, and their monolithic structure allows them to aggregate scaled user data in a way that makes it very efficient to present that value to advertisers and slurp up a majority of the advertising spend in the digital economy. On the other side, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of websites that are so disaggregated that they can't actually leverage user data with the same sorts of efficiencies of scale economically as the platforms can. So on the user data side, we needed a new standard for how user data was managed so that publishers could actually start to build the platforms necessary to enjoy the efficiencies required for a scaled competition with the platforms. And so usually when I talk about this, I kind of go on from there. But I thought, Sam is with me today, and so and I've been thinking about these things basically from my kind of ivory tower of my job at Google and up until this point in my career. And then Sam, on the other hand, was actually working on these problems while leading all of the engineering and product teams at Bleacher Report. So Sam, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what was it like back then to try and partner with other publishers at scale and figure out how to share content, how to monetize, that sort of thing.
So in general, reasonably painful to do so. They're really, RSS exists as a decent way to share information about content, but not a great way to share the content itself, particularly with any rules around the content. Something like AMP, which is kind of technology that we're focused on, helps the content transport with the business model that's associated with it, analytics with ads. So there wasn't really any standard for syndicated content with partners. We were working with Apple and we were working with Microsoft, and who had completely proprietary technologies. Every time we tried to integrate with any partner, it was an engineering effort that was separate from everything else we were doing, that required an ongoing maintenance overhead. So in general, it was pretty painful. It could soak up a lot of time and often didn't bring a lot of benefit for the amount of time we had to actually invest in trying to integrate with people.
Yeah, I mean, so we needed, as an industry, a standard for content syndication. I tried to get Google to launch a project to focus on this, but I wasn't an engineer. I was just a business guy, and so I wasn't allowed to do any of the most interesting things while working there. And that got to be increasingly frustrating, and so I ended up leaving in 2010 to join The Guardian, which I swore I would never work for a publisher because my whole worldview was that their businesses sucked. And so I thought, how could I ever leave the good food of Google for the bad, smaller business model of media? I was trying to save media. But in this case, the CEO of The Guardian actually gave me an opportunity that was too good to pass up. And I thought I was not succeeding in getting Google to actually launch this project while I was an employee at Google, but I was also very familiar with the challenges that Google was facing in the European market because of the role that I had on the strategy team. And in particular, Google was looking at a major fine in the EU for having violated some EU regulations around antitrust. And the difference between the top level fine and something less is a political calculation. And a political calculation is usually a function of your friends lobbying for you in the hallways of Brussels. And Google had no friends at that time. And so I thought maybe I could get Google some friends. And so I was talking to the CEO of The Guardian and saying, hey, you and the other CEOs of major media companies, you and Google are actually kind of aligned on a lot of things. Right now, there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of animosity, but really, when you think about it, you're really aligned on a lot of things, and so maybe you could say some nice things about Google in Brussels, and Google would build some things that you guys need for your industry to operate better. And he's like, what? I'm like, oh, I got a list. So I had this whole grocery list of things I wanted Google to do that I couldn't get Google to do while I worked there. And so I ended up quitting Google and joining The Guardian so that I could form this coalition of European media companies and give my list to those CEOs, talk them through it all so that they agreed with me that that's what their industry actually needed, which was harrowing considering the fact that I had never worked for a publisher before. But it turns out I was right about all those things, and so that was comforting. And then one of the things on that list was, can we launch an open source project to define a global standard for syndication on the open web? And so now it was the European publisher CEOs who had a lot of political influence in Brussels asking Google for that. And Google was much more receptive to them than it was to me when I was an employee. And so they said yes, and we launched the AMP project. So the AMP project was launched 3 years ago for the purpose of, at least from my view, for the purpose of establishing a global standard for content syndication across the open web. There were some ancillary benefits to the specification that were very, very, very obvious in terms of how fast a page would load. So like a typical local news website from like the Modesto Bee would take 20 seconds to load on a mobile browser. And then if that same page was built in AMP, it would take about 700 milliseconds. And so Google thought that was the coolest thing about the AMP project. And so they really, really pushed that for the next couple of years as a primary value proposition of coding your pages in AMP instead of standard HTML. I thought if everybody did it, then we would have pages that were portable, with the business that was portable. Now I could render somebody else's AMP page on somebody else's domain, and their business would all work. Like the ads, the analytics, the paywalls would all work on that AMP page rendered through a viewer on anybody's domain. We would have established a global standard for content syndication. And so that's what happened. Google did an amazing job of getting most of the world to start to embrace the AMP standard for building web pages. And 3 years into it, we're probably about 15% of the open web. About 60 million websites are publishing AMP pages alongside their canonical URLs. And so it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger every day. And so a coalition between the publishing industry, really led by the Europeans, and Google are succeeding in establishing a new global standard for how you build fast-loading, awesome-performing web pages for the media industry. Then Google quickly realized that it'll only become a standard if it moves beyond the media industry and into e-commerce. And so I think eBay now is probably the largest publisher of AMP pages because all their product pages, they want their product pages to load really, really fast so people buy stuff faster and buy more stuff. And so it lent itself really well to e-commerce, which kind of helped grow the standard. So then what I did was I started up a company. I was only an employee at The Guardian for about 6 months, and then I became an advisor. I cycled off of being a full-time employee, and I became an advisor to the coalition for the next year and a half as we continued to engage with Google on a variety of other initiatives, and then also starting to engage with Facebook. I was always on the publisher side of the table at this point, and representing them in those negotiations. Meanwhile, I started up another company called Relay Media, which was for the purpose of helping publishers just get onto the AMP standard. So we created a converter technology so that if you were a publisher without any engineering resources, or if you had engineering resources but they were busy with other stuff, you could use our converter to just convert your standard web pages into AMP web pages in a way that you didn't have to do any work. And that went pretty well, and after about a year, we had about 100 publishers using it. We were doing probably about 75 million monthly uniques of just AMP traffic. And our AMP pages were super beautiful because my CTO in that company was a total genius. And so Google really wanted us to scale up that operation. I wasn't as interested in scaling that product. I had some other ideas in mind. And so long story short, it just made sense to sell the company at that point to Google. So that they could use the technology that we had created and scale it up in other ways. And so in 2017, I sold that company to Google. I thought I was going to have some free time, but I was talking to some friends at the World Economic Forum in Geneva about all this stuff, and that I had worked with them in the past at the Davos conference. I know you guys are familiar with the Davos conference, it happens every year, and they asked me to help them put together the agenda for the Davos conference that had to do with the part of the agenda that had to do with fake news and disinformation. And so I was working with them on that, while at the same time I was talking to Sam, and the timing of it is like, I want to get back to that idea of using AMP as a syndication standard for a global content exchange. And in talking to Sam, there was the timing of it was right, and so I ended up doing both. So we ended up starting Distributed Media Lab in November, and at the same time, I ended up kind of engaging with the World Economic Forum to flesh out the agenda for the Davos conference around disinformation and fake news, but really for the purpose of actually using the World Economic Forum to bring some people together from around the world to focus on the second fundamental issue, which was the user data issue. And so maybe before I get into that, Sam, like you were there. We were talking about it back in like October, November of last year. What were some of your thoughts about this whole concept that is now Distributed Media Lab?
I spent like 7 years at Bleacher Report, who had taken a reasonably different approach to distribution of their content, and the way that they not necessarily syndicating content onto other people's websites, but distributing and building relationships with other publishers to actually build that as a media property. And I've taken a very open approach to, we'd much rather link out to people and have them link back to us than build a walled garden where we only link to our own content, which is still to this day the way a lot of publishers think about the world. A lot of the products and technology that were built while I was at Bleacher Report was focused around making that really easy to do, making that easy to manage from a business and editorial perspective, and aligned very well with the goals of this from a syndication perspective. Certainly some of the products we built from a user experience perspective that lived on Bleacher Report and were only on Bleacher Report have translated well into the products that we're building now that can be embedded on anyone's website. So all the products that we built for Bleacher Report that had fantastic user engagement there, we're now building kind of versions of those that are transportable across many publishers' content and sites as well.
Yeah, so we launched Distributed Media Lab like about this time last year. And then at the same time, I was engaged with the World Economic Forum, hosting these meetings to discuss some ideas around user data reform. What happened on that side of the equation was I had some ideas about a standard user data schema that could be traded across a global exchange that between publishers, so that publishers could actually trade user data rather than publishers buying third-party user data from a bunch of companies that normal consumers have ever heard of, but they know everything there is to know about you. What I wanted to do was disintermediate the entire third-party passively aggregated data marketplace and accrue the economic value of that sector to quality publishers, but to do it in a way that allowed for quality publishers to abide by what at that point was looming GDPR regulatory requirements in the European market. Now, the GDPR regulations in the European market are incredibly complicated to engineer for. In fact, Sam and I have been in some conversations, on this side of the equation with some engineers at Mozilla, where we actually had to ask the question: is it possible to engineer a solution for the GDPR regulation? Because it's not obvious, but it is obvious that there were no engineers in the room when they wrote the regulation. And so it's like they do that in Brussels. They come up with some really awesome public policy ideas, and they don't include any engineers to know whether or not it's physically capable to abide by. And so we had to kind of come up with a very different approach to how we wanted to do this. But what the goal of it was to put publishers in a position where they could achieve symmetry in the negotiation in the digital economy in competition with Google and Facebook. If the primary value of the advertising economy is based in the user data that is aggregated, how could we present to a disaggregated sample of companies a method for competing with the same level of efficiency as Google and Facebook enjoy? And so on that project, we ended up having a bunch of meetings with a bunch of people from around the world, mostly chief data officers from major publishing companies and other advertising agencies and things like that in Europe, meeting with the representatives from the EU government, the UK government, German government, Canadian government. Fortunately, the US government doesn't care about this stuff. So don't have to go to DC to have these conversations. Sacramento does. We just passed a California privacy protection law a couple months ago here in California. So California is acting as the de facto public policy for the U.S. as far as privacy protection online is concerned. But so I met with all these governments, met with all these publishers, met with all these kind of non-governmental agencies, and developed some consensus around the project. And so where that stands now is I'm a Mozilla Fellow working with funding from Craig Newmark, who wants to save the news business badly, and is donating his money towards that goal, and working in association with the World Economic Forum to flesh out the building phase for this project. Meridio is what I call it, which is a Greek word for share, and I got the domain from merid.io, which I thought was super clever, and so it's all good. And next comes the hard part. But then with Distributed Media Lab, Sam and I have been plugging away on this since really December, January. A year ago, we've basically built a platform that allows someone to create a collection of content, like go grab a bunch of links, put it into a collection that is an embeddable thing on any website. And so we launched originally, the first publisher that we launched with was this tiny little news website in Santa Barbara, which I'm a fan of because I spent a lot of time in Santa Barbara. I've got family there. And so they covered the fires and the mudslides very, 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 very aggressively, and so I was just glued to it. My brother-in-law lost his house in the Montecito mudslides in February. Silver lining is he learned a lot from that experience that he could talk to my father-in-law about, who just lost his house in Paradise. And so the family had a really awesome Thanksgiving, where everyone was like coming together. My sister-in-law, her family, her married family has a sporting goods store that burned down, I think in like June, and they had to rebuild that. So I almost didn't want to spend Thanksgiving with them because there's such bad luck, like on all sides of that family. But anyway, so I spent a lot of time in Santa Barbara. The local news website there is this little site called NewsHawk, and so I asked them if we could work with them to pilot this crazy harebrained scheme, and they said yes. And so we started building collections of third-party content to embed on their sections across their website. And then from there, we've launched on about another 25 to 30 websites. I think one of the fun ones we've worked on is with Cal Matters, which is a nonprofit news organization based in Sacramento that covers California politics very, very, very aggressively. They wanted to use our platform to syndicate their voter guide collection of web pages out to local news sites across California. And so we did that leading up to the election, and that was a really fun thing to see, the kind of engagement that people were having with their voter guide, which I think was the best voter guide out there leading up to the midterms. We're also working with MarketWatch, which is primarily business and economic news, Dow Jones publisher. They wanted to use the platform in a different way. When they tweet out one of the links to their web pages, and somebody clicks on that link in Twitter, then Twitter shows that web page, and then the person goes back to Twitter. So the average number of pages per referral is 1, because that's the user experience. So they thought, can they bundle a bunch of MarketWatch pages together so that when somebody clicks on it in Twitter, it loads a viewer that provides navigation so that you can engage with more pages before you click out of it and go back to Twitter. And so we did that. They created a site called marketwatch.com/discover, where they're just aggregating all of their own AMP pages. And then when they tweet those out, now the Twitter app or Twitter mobile web will actually frame our viewer inside Twitter and allow for deeper engagement. But more importantly, since it's AMP, it maintains control over monetization for MarketWatch. So now MarketWatch effectively has this little vehicle for driving deeper engagement while maintaining control over monetization across social distribution, which changed the game in terms of how to think about their relationship with social platforms. And so then we were measuring that and just like, well, is it working? Are people actually engaging more? And so fortunately, like the statistics that we've been getting back from them have been really, really, really encouraging, where I think about 40% of the time people click onto the second page. And so it was like a 40% lift in engagement just from this new mechanism for rendering a web page on somebody else's app or website. And but maybe, Sam, you could talk about some of the challenges that we faced in like, what are some of the challenges of using AMP in a collection of third-party content on somebody's domain?
AMP's actually been pretty good for that. Yeah. I'm not, the challenges are maybe somewhat different. I mean, the challenge of actually putting content on someone else's website more holistically, certainly at the time I built Bleachable, AMP didn't exist. We pulled in a lot of third-party content onto the website, but as is the case with a lot of people who do this right now, you're really kind of just pulling in the title and maybe kind of the first paragraph, and there's some fair use rules around how much content you can use, but you're not really giving the full experience. You're not giving the whole piece of content. So that experience we built for Bleachable was pretty suboptimal. With AMP, it gives you the opportunity, because the content can be transported in its entirety, we're able to do a much better job of building that on top of somebody else's website. So the viewer that we have built allows you to click in and it pops open on desktop it's kind of like a dialog box. On mobile it takes up the whole screen that embeds that content in there. And because we control the experience, we control what's in the collection of content, we control what the next item of content is, you can sit down and swipe through a bunch of different articles. Now, it could all be from one publisher with MarketWatch, for example, but the technology kind of goes across multiple publishers, so you can sit there and swipe through content from 15 different publishers, and it's not something that easily one publisher could go build that. So there's definitely some challenges around integrating with the AMP project and what Google has built around that. Google has their own viewer that they have built. Microsoft recently launched one, I think Cloudflare has a viewer. I'm not really sure there's any other people that really have built true AMP viewers. Twitter and LinkedIn both use AMP with linked content in their mobile apps, but they only do it in the context of the native mobile app. They don't do it on web. What we've built is web-based. It's a very simple JavaScript embed. It's just like embedding a YouTube video And that was really one of the goals for integrating with publishers. Is so much work is required for publishers to integrate right now. It's like, okay, well, you send me the RSS feed and I'll give it to one of my engineers, and then 3 months later they'll integrate that into a content management system that pulls in the content and badly formats it. And what this allows us to do is just have that be a simple code that someone can cut and paste into a website that allows the embedding publisher to give a great experience, but also allows the people who created the content to maintain control of what that looks like. It's their page that gets embedded, it's their design, it's their ads and analytics, so they get full control of their content. And they're working with Cal Matters right now. They do syndicate content to other people, but they don't even have like a CMS level integration. They're putting some stuff up on Dropbox, and it's like a Word doc, and you cut and paste it in somewhere else. It's a very, very manual integration, and Cal Matters, as soon as they put that article up on Dropbox, they lose complete control. Like, they have no control of what happens to it after that. So now with the voter guide, we 25 or so sites, I think, put that on there, and Cal Matters had complete control of what was there. It was their design that we actually worked with them to customize that to make it a better embedding experience. It allowed you to jump between information around all the ballot measures, the candidates, news around the election, in an experience that was easily transportable.
Yeah, I mean, so before, if they wanted to change a page, update it or correct it, if there was an error or something, which is super important when it's a news organization, and they had that page syndicated to 200 or 2,000 partners, then they would need to call 200 or 2,000 people to make that change on that page. Now with AMP, they can just change their AMP page, and it's instantly updated everywhere. And nobody has to call anybody or talk about it. It just works. And so that was really the goal. I mean, to go back to the beginning, my mission in all of this was to establish a viable economic framework for journalism on the open web. But in order to have that viable economic framework, we needed different business models that were more designed for the decentralized architecture of the open web, which was fundamentally different than previous media mediums. But in order to have those different business models, we needed some new technologies to power those new business models to enable this new economy. And so those new technologies for me started with getting the AMP project launched, which was the form of an open source project led by Google, but also with great participation from across the industry. And then start a private company that could leverage that standard. And then on the user data side, same game plan, basically. Start an open source project to define a user data standard that can be used by the industry, and then launch a platform that would allow for the portability of that standard. Now, on the user data side, I think it's economically more important that the operator of that exchange be a nonprofit, because I think one of the problems that we have, one of the reasons for the fundamental problems that we have in the advertising economy across the open web is that the companies that operate it have a profit-based motive, which is great in a lot of cases, but in the case of ad tech, it's led to a lot of real problems. For instance, if I'm an ad exchange and I'm matching buyers and sellers, like advertisers that want to buy ads on websites, and I take a cut of the transactions that I'm facilitating, that's my business model. I want as many transactions as I can get so that I can make more money and I can become more profitable and I can grow my corporation and I can return shareholder value. But if that's my fundamental incentive, I don't really want to distinguish between fraudulent transactions and non-fraudulent transactions. And so as a result, estimates run as high as 45 to 50% of the entire programmatic economy is actually fraud-based. And it's a natural result of the economic incentives of the companies in the industry that have created this technology. And so that's why I wanted this thing to be a nonprofit entity, so that it wouldn't have that same economic incentive to pursue transaction volume at all costs. And I think that's the case for some industries. Some industries really need to be profit-based industries in order to scale properly. Other industries, it makes no sense when you think about the unintended consequences. And so for Project Meridio, I thought this is going to be a nonprofit technology platform. And for Distributed Media Lab, this will be the next global dominating force to compete with Google and Facebook for web domination. And so I get to have that bit of competition on the Distributed Media Lab side while doing something different with Mozilla and the World Economic Forum on the user data side. But again, the whole point of it all is how do I play a role in establishing a viable economic framework to save journalism? And to do that on the medium that's going to be the medium that we're all operating in for the next 100 years, which is the open web. So anyway. Questions?
So questions to see Claire and Hal are going to kick off the discussion.
Yeah. So I think it is true that current centralized publication, this model requires gathering people to their specific domains. And so however, I think centralization also provides the authority of the information. And people tend to believe the platform is responsible for content. So my question is, as an open web content distribution platform, how can DML prevent distribution of fake news?
Yeah, so there's two aspects to the question. One aspect of the question is how do you maintain brand value in a distributed model? Because when I go to the NewYorkTimes.com, there is this assumption that I'm trusting what I read on that website because I'm on that website. So the first question is how do you maintain that level of trust when you take the New York Times web pages and you have them rendered on a lot of different websites? Then the second aspect to your question was, what was the second aspect to your question? It was
how can DML prevent distribution of fake
news?
The
fake news thing. Yeah. So first of all, when we're talking about brand value, one of the cool things about the AMP standard is that if I'm the New York Times and I create an AMP page, it's my design, it's my analytics, it's my ads, everything about that page I'm in control of. Now that page may be rendered on somebody else's domain, but that page actually carries my brand value in terms of the design of the page and how the page operates. Now, so the question is, do you lose some trust when you're reading what is clearly the New York Times on something other than the NewYorkTimes.com? Well, that ship has long sailed because you can read the New York Times on a lot of places other than the NewYorkTimes.com, and the brand value of the New York Times doesn't seem to erode. So I'm saying that the brand value of a publisher is actually in the design, but more importantly, because the design is a signal to the reader of the historical commitment of a publishing organization to journalistic values. And so I think, ironically, it's those companies that have spent the most time establishing that trusted relationship who have the greatest brand value inherent in the design that is the signal to the reader that this is a trusted piece of thing. Now, the question is, how do we make that enormous trust and brand value that has been built up over decades and sometimes centuries, how do we translate that into economic value in the digital economy? And then this kind of parlays into my response to the fake news. So we're not a platform that allows for the proactive distribution of content to people who didn't ask for it. We're a platform where if you're a website and you think you know your audience and you think your audience would like content from those sources, you go and get it and you put it on your website. So I'm leveraging maybe a principle of behavioral economics in the model, assuming that people are going to put on their website the things they think their readers are going to want, rather than what we have today, which is the possibility of distributing fake news through the social graph in ways that the end recipients didn't necessarily ask for it, but were targeted to receive it. And so we're basically assuming that the content that will share better across our model is content that is high quality and is more relevant to the audience of whatever domain is embedding it. Now, one of the things that we're assuming that we're going to start testing in 2019 is the economic value of high quality content. Because one of the things that we're assuming is that if we can bundle quality content together into packages that can travel around the web, like did anybody study philosophy, like Leibniz, like monad? I always think about monads, like traveling through this metaphysical universe where, it's like this bundle of principles that can be transported across this ether, kind of substance. And now I've got this collection of websites that can get distributed. The value of that is going to be a function of what articles are included in this collection and how quality are they. And then the way we recognize that value is the monetization rate of the advertising that we can put into that collection. So I've been pontificating about the economic value of quality for several years, but then when I started Relay, I actually had a data point for the first time. And that data point was at Relay, we were actually publishing AMP pages only for about 100 publishers. And our business model was we would keep 20% of the advertising inventory that resulted from our AMP distribution. So we were only selling through AdX, Google's programmatic exchange, pure AMP inventory. So we could compare the monetization rates that we got from that programmatic exchange with the monetization rates of our partners that were selling both AMP and standard mobile web. So standard mobile web advertising inventory alongside their AMP advertising inventory was actually selling consistently at between 30 and 50% less than the CPMs we were getting in the same exchange, but pure AMP. So for the first time, it was a data point showing the value of quality that can be recognized by the machine, which is Google's programmatic ad exchange. And so I was like, oh, this is awesome, And so then it turns out that data point actually has started to extrapolate into other forms. Like now we talk to publishers who do a good job with their AMP, and they're outperforming from a mobile monetization perspective their AMP pages, which shows the value of quality. Now the quality can be attributed to the page loads really, really fast, or the page is super clean and easy to read, and people like it, and so the engagement is a lot higher. So these are the signals that are actually determining the monetization rate in the programmatic exchange from an advertising value perspective. It could be a function of a lot of things, but the thing is that it's a function of all these quality signals. So the more quality signals you rack up, what's that?
Less ads on the page.
And less ads on the page because the pages are just faster. And so I've had conversations with publishers that have put half as many ads on their AMP pages, and it performs 50 to 100% more than their standard mobile web pages from a revenue perspective. And so I feel like we're actually making progress towards that original mission of establishing a viable economic framework by creating a different advertising economy that is better for users and better for publishers. And then we're doubling down on that with the user data side. But we're just the first couple steps into it.
Claire?
Yeah, I actually
Oh, yeah.
had a question about the sort of the economic returns of this model. And so we've been talking a lot about an advertising-based revenue model. And I'm curious if you all have thoughts about how this could work for a subscription-based platform or a nonprofit news site.
Yeah. No, so Distributed Media Lab is distribution. And distribution is upstream from monetization. So if you have a larger audience, you can actually show more ads, or you can ask more people to subscribe or buy t-shirts or mugs or whatever.
Or donate in the
Donate.
case of nonprofit.
Yeah, so for instance, when we modeled out for Cal Matters the revenue potential of a distributed like a syndication network that they were in control of using our platform, there was the advertising opportunity, but there was also the donation opportunity. And so the donation opportunity was actually significantly greater than the advertising opportunity, but just for their content. Like I'm a big fan of content being behind a paywall. Speaking of just the for-profit context for a second, when that content is not necessary for democracy. So when it's news, when it's journalism that is for the purpose of holding power accountable and is the information that is required for us to be free and self-governing, I want that to be freely available. I think the free press in our society is as powerful as it is freely available. So I am really, really, really committed to saving the advertising economy because it keeps all that stuff free. Now, other stuff should be behind a paywall. Like if you're the Miami Herald and you cover the Dolphins like crazy, there are people who will pay for that beat coverage because they know that you've got two guys in the locker room before and after every single game getting insights that you're not going to get from anywhere else. People should pay for that. Yep. You don't need to know about how the Dolphins are doing to know how to vote. And so I want to save the advertising economy, but I also want to provide a greater customer acquisition funnel for either donations or subscriptions or membership. Yeah. And so that's why we're focusing on distribution.
One other thing, with one of the parts of AMP that is interesting, because it's the publisher's webpage that's being delivered. So someone like New York Times or Washington Post or LA Times, if they pop a paywall up after you've seen one article or two articles, like that's actually part of the model. So you could be on newshawk.com reading LA Times articles and you get one free article, and then the second article you get that pop-up that asks you to be a subscriber. So it's baked into the model and transports across anyone's website. Yeah,
the Times and the Post, their meters work in a distributed way because they built it. The Wall Street Journal has got a hard paywall, and so it's super annoying to engage with their content in a distributed network. But maybe they'll change that someday. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. I didn't realize how much of an impact AMP had in terms of like metrics and average numbers. I have had a little bit of cognitive dissonance listening to this, however, because my impression of AMP prior to this talk was that there was a sort of rare consensus between kind of decentralized internet people and like the journalism people that like AMP was not a good thing because it's kind of a move towards fully seeking power the platform.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of interested in seeing what has been the response to criticism in the past year or so. And then the second part of that is kind of a follow-up to his question about fake news. You kind of mentioned that there's metrics of quality in AMP, but they're mostly in terms of page loading speed and visual quality. But if InfoWars goes on AMP and delivers me a beautiful page full of InfoWars content, are you not also facilitating the kind of spread of that kind of fake news?
Yeah, so if InfoWars published AMP pages, then in order for our platform to play a role, then people would have to create collections of InfoWars and embed it on their websites.
Which seems like not a stretch, right?
Yeah, so if people would want to do that, then they can. So then if there are lots of conspiracy theory websites out there that want to show the latest conspiracy theory, that actually 75% of the time starts with Russia Today. Yeah. It's 75% of the time it's just copied and pasted right off on InfoWars, right off of Russia Today. But so whatever the current, Moscow disinformation operation meme happens to be, if there are websites, that want to do that, then they could do that if that was AMP. And then if people wanted to engage with those websites, they could, which is exactly what happens today. And so where we would fit in is where, so that is a different situation than the way the disinformation operations and the conspiracy propagations work today, where Moscow comes up with some crazy ass scheme, and then they put it on Reddit and 4chan, and then it bounces to Twitter, and then they loop in the show producers for Tucker Carlson's show and Sean Hannity's show, and then they get on air, and it takes about a week for that whole process to occur. That is where it's being propagated across a network that then ends up finding a passive audience that didn't actually know that was what was happening. So, in our case, it would be if InfoWars creates an AMP page, and then somebody else creates a conspiracy website that wants to render their content, and then an audience goes to that conspiracy website to actually engage with that content, then yeah. So, yeah.
I have a question on, do you feel why is that?
Oh, wait. Actually, but you also have some issues around the AMP. I didn't get to the AMP objections. Yeah. No, there's been tons of AMP objections. So the first AMP objections. Sorry to cut you off. I just want to make sure I didn't blow past that. The first objections from AMP really came from when we first got started with the AMP project. It didn't monetize as well, and that was largely because we had only talked to 5 or 10 ad tech companies, and they had only built 3 or 4 different ad formats that worked on AMP. Now there's over 200 ad tech companies that have all built their AMP versions, and now it's monetizing better. And the value of a clean, fast-loading page is now becoming recognized from a revenue recognition perspective. The second more kind of existential objection to AMP was really the question around, are we, in embracing AMP, just giving absolute control to Google over the entire open web? Because we're no longer building websites in the standards of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're now building websites using AMP HTML, and we're relying on Google's cache to provide the speed and the the jurisdiction over validation. So fortunately, and then also it was part of an open source project that had Google as a what I would always refer to as a benevolent dictator open source project governance structure. So a couple months ago, Google announced that they're actually expanding the governance structure. So I know that they're in active discussions with lots of other companies to participate in the governance structure of that open source project. And Microsoft has launched its own cache. Cloudflare has a cache. Now they, as of like a couple weeks ago, you can actually have your own URL in the AMP page instead of it being a Google cache URL. And so the fact that it's not necessarily true won't stop journalists from writing about Google's dominance. So there's that. Yeah. But I mean, the thing that people don't realize is that the AMP project was started at the request of the publishers. And at that time, Google didn't plan on doing this, which is the whole reason I left Google. The publishers had to ask Google to do it. Now, we got lucky because at about that same time, Facebook was talking about instant articles. And so this market competition that Google was looking at over the horizon coming from Facebook instant articles definitely lent itself to providing a thrust behind Google's interest in the AMP project. But the fundamental interest that Google had in partnering with the publishers to launch the AMP project was the realization that Google's core business comes from the robustness of the open web. The better the open web, the more people are searching for stuff there. The threat that they were facing was that perhaps in the future, all things you want to buy are searched for in Amazon.com, and all information you want to discover is found in Facebook, making the open web a less robust, less fertile field for Google's decentralized business model of AdSense and AdWords powered by search. And so Google was looking at it from a fundamental perspective in that in order for Google's core search advertising business to thrive, the open web has to thrive, which is in opposition to the models of Facebook and Amazon. And so that was really Google's motivation. Plus, we said we would help them out with that big fine. They were looking at an $8 billion fine. I think it ended up being 2.6, so they were stoked. We helped them out. But yeah.
Actually, it's related to your last comment on that, because I'm just thinking, eventually, would that be really centralized or decentralized? Because it's in mobile, if the traffic is eventually in Amazon or Facebook, of the traffic of those web pages, then it doesn't really work. And why I'm asking in that way, the background in what happened in China is like, if you look at Tencent, WeChat, Moment, and also the company I work for, ByteDance, is the biggest news aggregator. They both, create something very similar to AMP, but it's like as a media format. It's like a template, so the publisher can create content based on their requirements, and you can share all those links. Yeah. But eventually, it's like those platforms will create those monetization dashboard, the user data dashboard, to enable those, content creators to thrive in their close ecosystems. So I'm just wondering what's the difference between, different cultures or the American market? Yeah,
well, I guess different political systems. Mm-hmm. So like in the Chinese market, there is the benefit of standardization because the government can just force it. In non-communist markets, you don't have that same standardization benefit, but you also have human rights. So that's a plus. And now, so like in the Asian, in China, they forked AMP. That's always a threat. I mean, that's always a threat. I think that it was a challenge. It was a challenge to Google when Amazon forked Android, and then that became a real problem over time. I think one of the things that I think about a lot and probably keep an eye on is that. So right now, the AMP standard is governed by virtue of passing validation to get put into an AMP cache, either Google's or Cloudflare's or now Microsoft's. So then it becomes a question of like, how do those companies collaborate in determining what are the requirements for validation? And then that becomes the way you govern the AMP standard. Now, if that starts to erode, if the governance of the open source project starts to erode because everyone's just too worried about Google taking too much control so that they then fork AMP, then we've kind of destroyed the whole point. We've kind of gone back to a disaggregated structure for how to build web pages. Now, for a lot of people who have been, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question.
It's a quick follow-up. It's like, what's the publisher's attitude towards the instant articles like Facebook, which also contribute the large traffic?
I would maybe have a slightly different answer to you
on
your initial question, which I think was the second piece, which is what you're describing actually operates a lot more like Facebook's instant articles, where it's a platform. Your content lives on that platform. In the case of instant articles and your examples, they may be providing user dashboards and monetization dashboards, but it's a closed ecosystem. You're giving your content to that person, they put it on that platform. That is not what AMP is. Now, although it is kind of sponsored by the benevolent dictator of Google, you are the source of the information. There is no AMP user dashboard. It's your analytics. Now, you could be using Google Analytics, but you could be using Adobe Site Catalyst. You could have your own analytics that you wrote. Your ads could be through Google DFP, but they could be through something else. So it's not a platform in the same way. You're the source of that information. You can train far more control. Now, it's a standard rather than a platform, and the AMP cache, which is really the internet hosted by Google piece, which a number of people have objected to, that is it's basically a reverse proxy cache that Google pays for the servers for, and it runs on ampproject.org. Microsoft has one, Cloudflare has one now. We have discussed whether at some point we would build one. We kind of have the beginnings of one but we actually still run it through Google because they have the scale from a global footprint perspective. But anyone, in theory, could go build an AMP cache. It's not a Google specific thing, and it's more of a standard than a platform. So there's quite a big difference. I think publishers are really not happy with Facebook instant articles because the monetization sucks. Yeah. And so many of the decisions really revolve around how much money you're going to make off them. AMP has done really well from a monetization perspective because the experience is of higher quality and people are willing to pay more money to put an ad on a better experience, and often with less ads on it, which has been really good to see, because I think that will be a bigger forcing function in the industry. If you can make better money with less ads, then it's better for everybody involved.
Yeah, I mean, and that's from the advertising perspective. The publishers are also not happy with instant articles from a subscription perspective, because when you're the Washington Post and you post an instant articles to Facebook, it gets seen by someone who's probably a subscriber and then shared with people who are probably subscribers. Whereas when you publish something in AMP and it gets discovered through search, I mean, it's an unqualified customer acquisition funnel. And so that leads to, so they are way happier with the volume of conversion to subscription from AMP than they are from instant article. And so ironically, the social graph actually impairs opening up the mouth to the customer acquisition funnel for subscriptions in Facebook, whereas in search, having no targetability actually lends itself to a larger customer acquisition funnel. So, yeah.
I'm one of the 9 journalism fellows, so that's the perspective from which I'm asking this question, which is, the AMP is for mobile pages. What happens on desktops? Do we have a solution to have portability with the business model?
Yeah, so it's a terribly named piece of technology. Accelerated mobile pages was more about...
We were originally calling it portable content units, and then Bez, the VP, Dave Besbris, who's the VP of engineering at Google, who was overseeing the whole thing for Google side, he was thinking, this makes web pages load so fast. Let's just call it accelerated mobile pages. And I remember when he called, I was in London, and he called me and one of the guys at The Guardian. We had this conversation, and but it's not just for mobile. It's like, yeah, but let's just focus on mobile for a little while. And so it was never really intended to be only on mobile. And then we changed the name to AMP. Because that wasn't a hill.
So I'd say a couple of things to that. If you search on Google on your laptop and on your phone will have AMP articles, your laptop will not right now. It's a web page though. Some people, some publishers have done a better job with making that page responsive. So if you pull up The Guardian, a Guardian AMP page on a desktop, it's pretty narrow. Other people do a great job with it being responsive. Like Vox Media's pages are beautiful. Condé Nast, beautiful pages on all screen sizes. Our viewer on a desktop is not the full. Our viewer is responsive, and if the content is well done from a responsive perspective, it looks great at all widths. At a certain point, if you have a really huge monitor, it'll look narrow in the middle, and there's not too much we can do about that. But on a mobile device, it looks great. So there really is nothing in the AMP standard that is mobile specific. It's more down to how well the designers and engineers who built the page have thought about the responsivity of that design. Because if you're on an iPad, then you've got 2 different ratios there, which can be quite wide. iPad Pro is bigger than most laptops now. So there's the approach is really down to the implementation of the CSS within that AMP page.
Yeah. So this is marketwatch.com/discover. And their CSS on this page is a little bit narrower than our viewer mainframe, but maybe it's because I've never looked at this in Safari before. But usually MarketWatch does a good job of filling the space with their CSS. But that's really the main difference.
Yeah.
So
one of the things you'll see as you're clicking that button, it's just sliding in. One of the things that AMP does provide, and was largely driven by the Google search experience, was the ability to pre-render content. So as you're clicking through this, it's maintaining a stack of pre-rendered articles so that they can just slide in.
Yeah.
But it's done in a smart way on the AMP side. So as the content loads and it's hidden, it's in a pre-rendered state without triggering ads, without triggering analytics, like Twitter embeds aren't there. It won't preload any images below the fold. But as you slide it in, we're actually communicating back and forth with that AMP page to say, okay, you are now visible, and it moves. We move it into the page, and that triggers the analytics, the ads. Twitter embeds loads. It'll start to pre-render the images that fall below the fold. That interactivity would not be possible without the cache of the pages, because Google actually adds in the communication between the viewer and the page itself. If we were using the AMP page that was actually resident on the publisher's site, the source AMP page, we wouldn't be able to do that piece. So we could load pages, but we couldn't slide them in a pre-rendered way. In the same way, it would be a flicker as a new page loads rather than a transition.
Yeah, and here's an example. Like on Cal Matters, we're doing the internal research also with them in addition to the syndication network. And
I had a part 2, which is, does this work with the ad blockers? And second is, you said 15% of all pages are ad pages. Do you see that exponentially growing? 3 years down the line, 4 years down the line, you see AMP pages taking over?
Yeah, and you want to hit the ad blocker?
The ad blocker can be a little bit of a challenge, and we've seen some inconsistency with that. The viewer that is loading in is JavaScript, so that can trip you up with ad blockers. That I think as we scale up, that will be an area of continued focus. From a implementation perspective, we've tried to keep this incredibly simple for someone to cut and paste into their page, but from a very, very small footprint from the kind of requests that it makes, so that it's very easy for a publisher to engage their own engineering team to potentially could host the JavaScript, or they could kind of CNAME it in. So it looks like it comes from their domain, which can help with an ad blocker so that it looks like it's coming from a first-party piece of JavaScript rather than a third-party piece of JavaScript. From a user privacy perspective, there's these two different projects, DML and Meridio. Meridio is very, very focused on user privacy and the user data and the ability to control your own data as a user. On the DML side, we don't touch user data. We don't drop any cookies. So from an ad blocker perspective, we don't look like an ad. We don't have iframes with iframes with iframes that are dropping like 20 different cookies that are all third-party cookies that are trying to track you because you looked at that one toaster. You're going to see it for the next 2 weeks at every website on the internet. We're not doing any of that. So it's a very clean piece of JavaScript that is designed to drop into a page with a very low footprint, but not do anything that appears to be untoward.
And then your second question was...
Will be
Oh, yeah. I hope so.
I think one of the things that Dave mentioned earlier was the focus on e-commerce.
Yeah.
There's decades of studies now around kind of the speed of your page loading having a big impact on the conversion rate of people purchasing products. So I think, while it initially started focusing around content, the translation into e-commerce will be huge, and there's obviously a very big financial incentive around everyone knows if I can get that page to load faster, more people will buy products.
Yeah.
If we see the same thing continue to happen with the advertising revenue, where AMP pages monetize higher at a higher rate, there's a lot of financial incentives for everybody to take part in that. And
yeah.
It's the other thing I'd add to that is WordPress powers some absurd percentage of the internet, and they
it's like 33%.
Yeah, they're working very closely with Google. Dave's ex-COO is working on that project to help. Basically, every page that's powered on WordPress is going to have an AMP version. So when that finally rolls out and completes, then it's like a third of the internet all of a sudden gets amped. You can do it on WordPress right now, but it's a plugin you have to install rather than being just like default behavior.
Yeah, the new it'll still be a plugin, but the new AMP plugin is awesome. That's just in beta right now. But I think I'm a big believer in economic incentives driving behavior at scale. And so what are the incentives? And so the incentives to jump on the AMP bandwagon early was to not get excluded from the carousel and search results. And so that really applied to news publishers that wanted to be in that carousel because they published breaking news. If you were an information website that wasn't expecting to show up in a newsy query, then that incentive didn't really apply to you. So for instance, one of the other publishers that we're working with is not actually a publisher, it's a nonprofit healthcare organization, the American Heart Association. So the American Heart Association publishes a ton of healthcare related, heart disease type related content. They were not expecting to show up in search results in kind of a newsy query, and so that carousel really didn't apply to them, so they didn't bother amping their content. What they do though is they syndicate their content through AP to thousands of local news sites that just want that healthcare information to fill out their healthcare section on their website. And so what they wanted to do was do it with our platform, which would give them much more control and less operational overhead managing that entire syndication network. But they weren't amped. So we needed to amp them for them so that they now could take part of this opportunity. But that was the incentive for them to start getting amped.
Yeah.
Same thing with NerdWallet. NerdWallet is this financial services startup in San Francisco, and they've employed about 70 journalists. There's like 8 Pulitzer Prize winners among them, and they're writing financial, industry news. They're in the process of now amping because they syndicate. They weren't expecting to show up in the top page of search results either, so they never bothered amping until we talked to them, and now they're in the process of amping. And so it's like if the incentive is there, then people will start to amp. Same thing with like my one of the guys that I work with at the World Economic Forum. They publish a lot of really high quality global economic news and information, and they're now amping because they want to use us for syndication. So they weren't amping to get into the search results because it didn't apply to them, but they will amp for the sake of the syndication opportunity.
Yeah, and the thing that we're doing interesting with the Heart.org guys, we're not trying to build the AMP pages that would go in a Google search. We're building AMP pages that look more native to our viewer. So there is, it's got the logo at the top, but that's in our viewer. There's no header at the top of that page. There's no footer at the bottom of that page. There's no right rail. Like, we scraped the content out of their website and built them custom pages that look good in this context. And that's also what we did with the CalMatters voter guide.
Yeah.
Where actually it was a more seamless integration, but American Heart Association could just email this to 200 publishers, and it's just like cut and paste this into your website, and you have all this content, and you can even, this example I think actually has like navigation where we could actually build out, it's almost like embedding an entire website where they could have site-based navigation, so you could jump around a whole different sections of content.
And the cool thing about this is that this is a branded viewer. And so when I go talk to The Guardian or Hearst or the New York Times or Washington Post, and then I meet with their brand studio people, and their business is growing 20-30% year over year. And it's like the one happy place, in the whole building. And then you ask, well, why is it only growing 20 or 30% per year? Because demand is high. It's because they're only actually distributing that brand content on their own properties. So if they could actually take a package of a brand content campaign and distribute it on 2,000 partner sites, now they can charge more, because it's a bigger campaign, and the advertisers are loving this format when it's being done by one of those really high reputation news organizations that users trust. And so this is like, so the monetization rate for an ad showing up on a page in a programmatic exchange may be $3. That same ad sold by a human may be $20. That something like this would sell for a CPM of like $50. And so this is really what everyone's trying to move towards and away from display. But then how do we, like, only the New York Times and the Washington Post are going to be the ones with the brand studios that succeed. How do we have that trickle down all the way to the local news website? And the way we do it is because we created this decentralized model that actually pays them to actually carry this content while leveraging the brand of the originating publisher. Yeah.
One last question that Hal had raised about blockchain technology.
Oh yeah, blockchain.
Which is decentralized, and is that gonna,
well,
are you gonna use it? Is it gonna compete with you? Or?
I'll give my response, and then Sam could probably give a much better response. Blockchain doesn't really apply to Distributed Media Lab because we're just doing something completely different. It doesn't really need any of the things that blockchain offers. When it comes to the user data project, however, we are actually considering a distributed ledger. However, the way blockchain works, from my non-engineering kind of ability to assess it as a potential technology for us to use in that user data context, was that we're trying to apply to the advertising industry. And so just latency in terms of calculating across the blockchain is a challenge. And then also privacy is challenging. And so it didn't seem to really be applicable, which was sad for me, because if you say blockchain, at least up until like a few weeks ago, it seemed like it was sexy. Now I'm kind of thinking there's going to be a bit of a backlash. People don't seem to want Bitcoin anymore. But anyway, Sam could probably give a better engineering response.
For DML, it's not particular, but we're not really dealing with any kind of like ownership or smart contracts or anything like that. The Meridio project, one of the key requirements on the Meridio side that really comes from the GDPR legislation is about revocation and being able to remove data. And that's something that, as we've looked at blockchain, we may end up building something around that is blockchain-like, but is not truly blockchain, because we need the ability to revoke a piece of information, have it be removed from the chain and have the chain self-heal around that. Yeah. But blockchain, by definition, won't let you do that because all the information has to stay there. So if you give consent to the New York Times that, I'm interested in luxury automobiles, and then you want to revoke that piece of information, it needs to come out of that. So for Meridio, we may end up, we've kind of had some